Welcome to Andalusia Part 1. This is the 8th in our Middle Eastern Islamic history series, Middle Eastern and North Africa, right? It's Part 1 because Part 2, which will take place on the 21st of September, we're taking 2 weeks off, will be conducted by Sergio Martinez. And I can't think of a better person to talk about the cultural developments of Andalusia than Sergio, and as well as the ability to show what arms and armament look like, really get into sort of the cultural parameters that today I'm going to spend much more time on the political organization and development. So for those of you who are familiar, please stand by. For those of you who are unfamiliar, we have the rules. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in any historical, religious, or sociological discipline, but it is going to be a secular presentation. I'm going to be addressing this from the perspective of a secular historian, not from the perspective of a religious individual, even though this is Islamic history. As is typical, I would say, let's be respectful of the topic. If Will Wheaton's laws, of course, don't be a dick. And if you have to be explained what that means, you're probably on the wrong side of it. But regardless of that, I cherish interactivity. So please ask your questions, comments, clarifications. I prefer if it's out loud, but of course, if you put it in the comment section, I tend to read them as well, and I'll answer your question. And I like to say that this class will be a 101 and a 201, by which I mean I'm going to cover the basics. So if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know anyway. And finally, like all the other 7 sessions in this series, this will be recorded, so you can always go back and relive your favorite eras in Islamic history, or check up on some definitions that we're going to be talking about, because every lecture is built on the previous lectures in the series. So, as is everybody's favorite moment in the lecture, we have the quiz to see what we remember from our previous lectures. So, question number 1. Which of the following accurately describes the state of North Africa in the 8th to 10th centuries?
I would say B.
Yeah, B is correct. Well done,
Yeah.
Howard. Right, we talked about how the Idrisids were a Zaydi Shiite group that lost a rebellion in the Middle East, and then those Arabs came to Morocco and established their dynasty. How the Rustamids or Tahir, they're known by both names, are an Ibadi group of Persians who came after failing in their own rebellion in Persia to Algeria and created their Tahir state. And that's what we typically see among the independent and autonomous areas of North Africa during the 8th to 10th centuries. Just to the other answers, we know that North Africa was not firmly under Abbasid control, right? The Idrisids, the Rustamids, the Aghlabids, to different degrees pulled away from the Abbasids, and the Abbasids did not successfully maintain campaigns against Umayyad Spain or the Franks. In fact, they were aligned with the Franks. They had a strong alliance. The Tulunids and Ikhshidids were not Arabized Egyptians, right? Those were Mamluks. Those were Turkish slave soldiers. And so that's incorrect for that reason. And North African states grew prosperous because of trade over the Mediterranean, right? They had numerous relationships with the European states. They had relationships also with African states in West Africa, like Ouagadougou, as we spoke earlier. So it wasn't exclusively trade with the Middle East, but it was trade with a number of other regions. All right, question number 2. What made the Aghlabid invasion of Sicily unique or special?
A.
That's not the case. Yeah, remember that the invasion of Spain in 711 was an amphibious attack that preceded the Aghlabid invasion by over 90 years.
Okay. C is a pet theory of mine for genetic invasion, for invasions in general. You get a small horde of Arabs show up, or anything else, or barbarians or anything else showing up. The local administration is taxing the living daylights out of everybody, and everything collapses.
That is true in some areas, but in the case of Sicily, there really wasn't persecution of the native Catholic population, because remember the church hadn't split, right? So
Yeah.
the Byzantines considered the Catholics as Orthodox.
Yeah.
So there were taxes, but generally speaking, there was a lot of resistance from the local population of the Arab takeover of Sicily. So that would be a correct answer about Egypt. It's not a correct answer about Sicily.
Yeah, I suspect that was the correct answer for the whole of North Africa as well. The Byzantine administration wasn't very strong.
No, actually, it's the other way around. As we talked about during the lectures, the Amazighs actually supported the Byzantines against the Arab invasion. That's why it took nearly 60 years for the Arabs to conquer North Africa, because they kept rebelling. The answer actually is D. One of the things that's very interesting is that the Aghlabids never renounced Abbasid suzerainty, and they did pay an annual tribute to the Abbasids, but the Abbasids had no functional control over the Aghlabids. And the Aghlabids were actually able to align with the Umayyads in Spain, who were the arch rivals of the Abbasids, and they together coordinated an invasion of Sicily. That's what really makes it special, is that the enemies actually were friendly enough to be friends, which really shows how independent Aghlabids were from the Abbasids, even though they were technically their suzerains. All right. Which three of the following are correct statements about the Iranian intermezzo?
E.
Okay, that's one answer. What are your other two?
Would A and C be the other two? Maybe.
I like it. C. Yeah. Oh, sorry, D.
It's actually B, C, and E. Those are the right answers. The Karakhanids did not open up these large trade routes. They controlled the Silk Road, but generally speaking, they were quite militant to the other groups, and so they're not considered part of the Iranian intermezzo, especially because they're not Iranian, they're Turkic, and they fought wars with the Iranians repeatedly. The Persian Tahirids were an Arabic-speaking Persian dynasty, and they were the first to really make a break with Baghdad and have a separate autonomous administration, so that's why B is correct. C, the Daylamite Buyids were the first Persian state since the Sassanids to call their ruler Shahanshah and restore the Persian court customs. That's correct. The Ghaznavids initiated a strong Shiite presence in Persia is completely false. The Ghaznavids were adamant Sunnis and in fact secured the alliance of the Caliph in Baghdad because of their Sunni allegiance. Iran would not become Shiite until 500 years later. The Samanids were massive patrons of the arts and language. That's correct. They were the ones to reinitiate Persian language and also to create the first Mamluk armies, which is why F is false. The Saffarids did not create these Mamluk Ghulam armies. That was the Samanids who did that. All right. Question number 4. Which statements reflect differences between the Seljuks and other previous Turkic rulers? Choose all that apply.
B sounds good to me.
Okay. What else?
What else?
I would say B is true and C is false.
Okay.
C is false.
E.
E is correct, right? We actually spoke about that.
No, E.
Yeah. E. Right.
Is D? Do they pillage everything they captured?
Yeah, no, I want to see if anybody caught that when Ralph said it. This is actually not true. The Seljuks did not pillage and burn most of the cities. They actually had a great amount of respect for the Persian structures that they encountered, and when they got there, they had the local administration continue to administer it.
One thing I noticed in the C is mentioned Khorasan, especially our troops died. 13 troops died from ISIS-K, which stands for ISIS Khorasan. Right,
because in the Islamic State world map, they use the terms that existed at this time to denote the different regions in which they're based. So, for example, the Islamic State organization, if it were to operate out of Ethiopia, would call it ISIS-H for Habasha, because that was the term the Arabs used for Ethiopia. So, Khorasan includes the area that is Afghanistan. So ISIS identifies that region as Khorasan, which is the same way that locals will still refer to it.
Interesting.
So the answers are A, B, and E. The Seljuks led a large confederation of independent tribes. In fact, this was the entire reason that you needed this the Iqta system that we talked about, right? That the individual tribes would take land and then they would be able to get the resources of that land without pillaging, right? Because then they'd have the rents from the people that were there, and that was used because there was such loose control over the confederation of tribes. And we also mentioned that some of them remained Tengrist even after they started settling in Anatolia, slowly converting to Islam over time. B is a huge distinction, right? The Tulunids, Ikhshidids, Ghaznavids, and a number of other Turks, where Mamluk or Ghulam, they were these Turkish slave soldiers that somehow became independent because they were soldiers, they had control of the military. And by contrast, the Seljuks were an independent Turkic group that ended up conquering their way to power. C is false. We discussed how because of this Iqta system, that control in the Levant, Anatolia, and certain other regions was much weaker than in the Persian Khorasani heartland, where the Seljuks ruled directly. D we talked about a little bit a few minutes ago, and then E was a huge part, right? Like they really reached out to the Persians to help them administer the empire. All right, and number 5, what is arguably the chief contribution of Nizam al-Mulk to the Great Seljuk Empire?
Not D.
Yeah, definitely not D. He was killed by the assassins.
I didn't know that, but lots of other people were too.
Well, I guess I think you indicated that C is correct.
Yeah.
D sounds good to me.
Yeah.
This is a feudal system, right?
Yeah, exactly. The Iqta was the first Muslim feudal system, and it created this relationship between the horse-owning Turks, these nomadic tribes of horsemen, and the local peasants, right? The fundamental difference between European feudalism and the Iqta system is that in the European feudal system, the barons or the landowners were typically from the same local region as the people over which they had power. Maybe they came from a slightly different province or something like that. But in the case of the Iqta system, almost all the landowners were Turks, and almost all the peasantry were Rum, right? The people of Rome, the indigenous Anatolians who lived under the Byzantine Empire.
That'd be similar to England, where the landowners were all Norman.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. Yeah, the other ones of these are false. Alp-Arslan and Malik Shah made their own military supply lines. That was sort of the demarcation between Persians and Turks, is that the Turks took care of the military needs and the Persians took care of the administrative. There was no mass conversion of Turkic tribes to Islam. It was a slow and gradual process. And yeah, we talked about D. All right, so
excuse me, Richard. Just one question from last week.
sure.
Right? Does Turkey Arabize?
Turkey did not Arabize, but Turkey also was never under the control of an Arab government, right?
But how about the Seljuk Empire? Does that
right? But the Seljuks were Turks. The Seljuks were coming from Central Asia. They were Turkic people, right? Their dominant language was related to the modern Turkish language that's spoken today in Turkey and Azerbaijan. Actually, probably closer to the way it's spoken in Azerbaijan because it had a lot more Persian in it. And modern Turkish has removed a lot of Persian language terms.
So it's more Persian than Arabic.
Yes, it was a Turkish-Persian hybrid.
Okay.
Yeah, so since they were never under the control of an Arab government, there was no Arabization process, but there was certainly a Turkification process because the indigenous population of Turkey, when they were conquered, they would consider themselves Roman. Their religion would have been what we now call Greek Orthodox. And over time, they became identified with the conquerors, with the Turkic conquerors. They began to speak their language. They began to follow Islam, which was the religion that was their official religion. And so there was a process of Turkification. In Turkish, they call it Türkleştirme, or which describes this same process of Turkification, which is very similar to the process of Arabization that occurred throughout the rest of the Middle East, with the exception of Iran for reasons that we've discussed. All right, so we talked about how we went from this caliphate that was inherited by Abu Bakr, right, the first caliph, from Muhammad, that's that red area, and then over the course of the Rashidun Caliphate, it expanded to that orange area. And then finally, during the Umayyad period, especially during the reign of Caliph Abdul Malik, it expanded into the pink area. So that by 750, all of the territories that are not, that are either pink or orange or red were under the control of the Umayyad Empire, right? And then 750 is when the Umayyads are replaced by the Abbasids, as we discussed in lecture 5, I think. All right, so, and we remember that the conquest of the Maghreb was incredibly difficult, right? It took from 647 all the way till 709. And there were 3 different iterations. Each time an iteration would start to gain some steam, one of the civil wars in the Arab world would happen, right? We had that Fitna al-Kubra, the first Islamic civil war in 661. We had that second civil war that occurred in the 680s concerning the succession of Muawiyah I by Yazid I. It was only when Abdul Malik ibn Marwan was able to destroy Carthage to the ground, and his general Musa ibn Nasr was able to clear a path all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, right? And he had to overthrow numerous Amazigh leaders, such as Dihya, also known as Kahina, right? Who is the successor to this Caecilius that you can see in the upper left-hand side. So one of the things, and we're going to talk about Morocco a lot because Morocco has a very intimate relationship with Spain during this period. So we have to understand what Amazigh are, these people who have been termed Berbers by foreigners, right? Berber comes from barbarian. So the proper term for them is Amazigh, that's their name for themselves, and they generally come in these 3 varieties. You have close to the coast and in the lowland regions, you have the Zenata, and the Zenata Arabized relatively quickly. And by and large, we're going to see that the Zenata are the allies of whoever controls Spain. The second group are the Masmuda. The Masmuda typically live in the mountainous regions. And then in the desert regions on the far side of the Atlas Mountains are the Sanhaja. And the Sanhaja tend to be allied with whoever is in Tunisia, right? That's the relationship that we're going to see. And the Masmuda tend to have a more fluctuating set of allegiances. So in this time to sort of get us settled on what was going on in Europe prior to the invasion, we have this map on the left-hand side. That's from the 6th century and 7th century. And so you can see there that the territory that we call Spain was controlled by the Visigoths. And it was pretty much all of Iberia, except for the northwestern part, which was controlled by the Suevi. The Visigoths tried to unite the peninsula, and at several points they were close to success, but the northwestern part of Iberia is incredibly mountainous. In fact, the entire northern part of Spain is mountainous, but northwestern Iberia particularly so. And you can see that's also why the Visigoths had trouble conquering the northernmost areas of Spain, like Vasconia, right, which is today known as Basque Country, and Cantabria, right? Those areas, that's why they're white. You had other tribes that were loyal to the Visigoths or friendly with the Visigoths in Aquitaine, and they had difficult relations with the Burgundians. But generally speaking, they were concentrated in Iberia, and they were the dominant power in Iberia. Now, until the year 565, the Visigoths were Arian Christians. Arianism was a heresy, but in 565 they renounced Arianism and became Catholics, or what we would anachronistically call Catholics. They became loyal to the Pope. In their Arian period, they were much more amenable to religious minorities, especially the Jews living in the country, but also Christians of various heretical groups. when they became Catholic, the persecution of these minorities increased. And we know about the shift from Arianism to Catholicism because of the numerous churches that they left behind. You can see one of them, Basilica Santa Maria de los Arcos in Tricio, which is in central Spain, very close to the modern day city of Soria in Castilla Leon. And these churches show evidence of Arian worship prior to the Catholic worship. On the right-hand side, we have the last king of the Visigoths. His name was King Roderick or King Rodrigo. And King Roderick was part of a succession battle that started in 710. His father, King Witisa, wanted his son Achila to succeed him. The problem was, though, that Achila was not supported by the majority of the nobles. Roderick was. And so Roderick made a move to become king of the Visigoths. The Visigoths had a process of voting on who would be the king. So Roderick won the vote despite the fact that Witisa wanted Achila to succeed him. And so this precipitated a civil war where Roderick would have the larger scale of forces on his side because more of the nobles were in line with him. This put Achila in a difficult position. It's believed that Achila actually invited the Arabs to invade as a mercenarial force that would assist him in overthrowing Roderick. And so the Arabs were able in 711 to bridge the Straits of Gibraltar and arrive at Gibraltar itself. The name, of course, Gibraltar, comes from the leading general who was in charge of the invasion, Tariq ibn Ziyad. There were two generals at that time who were working on conquering Spain. Of course, we talked about Musa ibn Usaid, who conquered northern Africa. He was also in charge of taking Spain. But Tariq ibn Ziyad was a recently converted Amazigh. He was a Nata. And he sort of jumped the gun, if you want to call it that, and beat Musa ibn Usair to make the landing on Gibraltar. And from that so because he landed on Gibraltar, that mountain took his name, right? So in Arabic, Jabal al-Tariq means the mountain of Tariq, like Tariq's mountain. So Jabal al-Tariq became Gibraltar, and the IQ dropped, right? Gibraltar. You can see from the map that it was actually a very quick progression through Spain until they get to the French territories. All right. So the first interaction between the Arab forces, Muslim forces, and the Spanish was in the Battle of Guadalete. So Tariq ibn Ziyad fought the battle, and during that battle, King Roderick was killed. The Muslims then effectively turned against both the supporters of King Roderick and the supporters of King Achila, and effectively won control of the southern part of Spain. Now, there are debates as to what happened to Achila. Some say that he was killed by Tariq ibn Ziyad. Some say that he was imprisoned forever. Some say that he was sort of imprisoned in a castle and cared for, but he wasn't allowed out. But regardless, Achila would no longer play any role in organizing the state. And so it became incumbent on nobles to either resist in their own individual cities or to submit to the new Muslim invasion. You can see on this map that there are blue arrows and there are red arrows. The red arrow represents Musa ibn Usaid, who tried to conquer the western side, while Tariq ibn Ziyad, who's represented by the blue arrows, made his way to Cordoba and then on to Toledo. The way that Musa ibn Usaid went was actually much more difficult and encountered much more resistance. So Tariq ibn Ziyad was the one who really conquered the central and southern Spanish heartlands. one of the things that we've noticed, and it's the reason I included La Juderia here, the Jewish quarter, is that, as I mentioned, during the Catholic period, the Catholic Visigoth period, the Jews were heavily repressed. And so the Arabs saw an opportunity there. They gave the Jews from the Jewish quarter weapons and asked them to hold the city down while they advanced further. And for those 3 years, from 711 to 714, while they were consolidating their hold on the south, the Jews of Cordoba and a few other cities were the ones that were maintaining law and order for the Muslims while the Muslims were advancing further north into the country. All right, any questions so far?
One question about the power of the Arabs. I mean, how do they conquer so fast? I mean, did they cross with horses in ships and they move on? And because it looks like it's very fast for all that territory.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They brought horses with them when they crossed at Ceuta and to the Strait of Gibraltar. No, the thing is that it was very fortuitous from the Arab perspective that they were given an invitation by Akhila to land, because they were very much afraid of trying to make that amphibious landing without protection on the inbound side, because otherwise they would just be destroyed navally. Morocco previously did not have a strong or powerful navy, so it was just whatever boats they could use to get across, but they did bring horses with them.
And the rest of Spain was kind of united, or they were very separated, and that's why they were being able to conquer so fast?
Well, the thing is that both the king and the pretender were killed or removed from power on effectively the same day, which meant that what was once a unified medieval system became all landowners for themselves, right? And so what you effectively end up with is this mass anarchy where the individual cities have to defend themselves, but there's no overarching government to support them or to allocate soldiers.
Yeah, in other words, you got one power controlling Spain. You defeat that thing and destroy their leadership, you've got the whole place.
Yeah, well, let me just add, though, it's not like the Spaniards are all getting along with each other. I mean, there's dissension within their groups also. Every landowner wants to be the most powerful landowner. So the Arabs quite often are very lucky whenever they invade some place, because there's usually some sort of civil unrest going on.
Yeah, but like, for example, if you look at Musa ibn Nusayr, who's that red arrow, he had a really tough time around Seville and Badajoz, which are cities in southwestern Spain, right? Seville put up an incredibly strong resistance. So it wasn't like they just went through perfectly unscathed. It just happened that the cities that Tariq ibn Ziyad hit were ones where the local population wasn't as effective at resisting, and ones where you had, for example, the Jews who were willing to hold a rear guard while the majority of the Muslim soldiers could advance, right? Because if they had to leave a garrison in every city they took, then they wouldn't be able to conquer so quickly. And of course, the famous Battle of Tours. So as the Muslims were advancing, you can see by about 720, they've taken most of the territory of Iberia. And they began to move into the territory of the Franks. The Franks were led by Charles Martel, and they encountered the Arabs at the city of Poitiers, or outside of the city is probably better to say. It was a forested area, and so this was an area that, this was a kind of climate and terrain that Arabs were less familiar with. From the Arab perspective, they were actually winning until some of the leading commanders were told that the booty train in the back, where they had taken all of the gold and other things that they had pillaged along the way, was being attacked. Right, that the Franks had done a flanking maneuver and were now taking all their stuff. This caused mass breaking within the Arab ranks, within the Arabo-Muslim ranks. And because of that, the French were able to encircle the now disjointed Arab cavalry and launch a crushing defeat.
Yeah, and one of the things that that I think most people aren't aware of is just how much of a proxy force they were, and that they were, you know, in essence, motivated the same way as you would argue pirates were motivated during the Great Voyage era. So they took in a force that was extremely motivated by, let's say, a remuneration than they were around, you know, national territory. And they confronted a force that was obviously motivated differently. So I think that's a
Arab force pillaging, or is it conquering? I'm sort of reinforcing your comment.
Yeah, no, it's the soldiers make money through pillaging.
exactly.
However,
exactly.
the Umayyad governing structure would then move in behind them.
That's right.
So this actually sort of goes also to Marika's question of how are they so fast? It's not a top-down command structure. It's not that the caliph in Damascus at this point, you know, is issuing orders saying, okay, you attack there, you attack there, you attack there. He would assign generals to certain regions, and those generals would have the prerogative to attack. And if those generals attacked, any booty that they claimed would be theirs. Any territory they acquired would be the caliph's. That was sort of the arrangement.
I mean, it's very Taliban-ish. I mean, not completely, but sort of when they're on the move. Very, you know, it's very diffuse, very dynamic, extremely opportunistic, light footprint. I mean, sort of all those advantages that you have when you are dealing with, you know, non-large command structured forces. But if you bring that force or those forces up against a large commanded force that's reinforced with logistics, I mean, you tend to run into some challenges, let's say.
Yeah.
Now, to that effect, Rich, and I'm sorry if I ask you the same question, but it didn't matter who took what, Berbers versus Umayyad soldiers, so to speak.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So you have representatives or Berbers that just converted over what, 80 years, 70 years ago?
Less than that.
Less than that. And then you have your Arabs that are coming from, you know, area of Damascus and different areas of Middle East. Did it matter when they were pointing out and say, you take this land, let's say Seville, and you take, you know, Toulouse, I mean, whatever it is, did that matter? And was Damascus kind of like in sharing this land? If Berbers would take a certain land, would they reassign it then to Arabs or stuff like that? Or that
Sure. There are sort of 2 points. The first one is that Damascus, whenever Damascus assigned a military general or a wali, a governor, to an area, it was always an Arab. And the Umayyads were incredibly, we would call them ethnocentric. The Umayyads had a very pro-Arab policy. The Abbasids were less so. The Abbasids were much more pluricentric in terms of their ethnicity, and much more inclusive of the Mawali, right? These non-Arab Muslims. But so those people who were appointed were almost always Arabs. However, you had people like Tariq ibn Ziyad, who were people who were found in the fields, right? As Musa ibn Usayd was conquering Morocco, Tariq ibn Ziyad had a coalition behind him. He had an army behind him. And so it was seen as legitimate because his goal was the same as the rest of the caliphates, which was expansion. When those territories were incorporated into the empire, of course, the governor who would be nominated would be one that would somehow connected to the Umayyads in particular. One of the defining features of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan that we talked about was that he set the precedent of keeping it a, quote, family affair. Almost all of the major government postings were taken by people from the Banu Umayyah family. So it wouldn't be that surprising to give another governorship to another Umayyad. That's not to say that the Amazigh couldn't be an incredible part of the administration or military apparatus, but they never had the expectation under the Umayyads of having control. In fact, we're going to discuss this leads to a number of revolts and rebellions by Amazigh because they want that power. They think they deserve it, which they may well do.
Right, because we know that Tariq also had ended up going to Damascus and kind of, and it's not really clear, and disappearing off the map of the earth completely.
Yeah, Tariq did that, and Musa, both of them.
Correct.
Well, I'm looking at the woman in the painting, and I'm assuming she became part of the booty
Oh,
that was taken.
I have no idea. This is just a very famous painting of the Battle of Tours. I actually don't know what the woman is supposed to represent. Yeah.
This is Romantic era painting. She's probably French, so she's probably being defended. Don't forget, this is a French painting, so the French are the good guys,
Yeah.
and the Arabs are nasty and evil.
So one of the things we discussed, and we sort of saw it from the other side, was we had the slaughter feast, right? When the Abbasids took control of the Islamic Caliphate and ejected the Umayyads, they didn't just eject them. They had a large feast for all 70 of the Umayyad clan members and proceeded to kill all of them, except for one. Abd-ar-Rahman fled, and you can see on the picture on the right-hand side his sort of flight all the way from Damascus to Cordoba, right? And he fled to Cordoba. But when he arrived in Cordoba, it's not as if everybody just bowed down and said, hail the Caliph. He encountered a very complicated situation. Now, this is a map from a little bit later in time, but it should sort of give you an idea about how divided the Islamic territory was. You had these number of city-states, and you had a number of independent generals who controlled parts and parcels of them. In fact, it took Abd-ar-Rahman about 20 to 25 years to reunite them entirely. He was finally able to do so outside of Cordoba. There's the Battle of Musarra, also called the Battle of Alameda, depending on language. And at that battle, Abd-ar-Rahman had brought with him a number of Arab soldiers, including people from Yemen, people from Damascus, all the way to Spain. And that year, Spain had a particularly bad drought in the south. So his forces were underfed and starved. And Yusuf al-Fihri, who was one of the generals who existed in the northern part of that Arab world, was not suffering from the drought. So he actually had his soldiers eating food in copious amounts right across the river just to antagonize Abd-ar-Rahman. And it really shows the kind of person that Abd-ar-Rahman was in terms of his courage and his charisma, that he was able to challenge Yusuf al-Fihri directly and defeat him outside of Cordoba, take the city, and declare that he was the emir, that he was the prince. Now, he didn't declare a caliphate because the Abbasid caliphate at this time was very strong, and he knew in 756 that he could not muster the forces to repel the Abbasids, who would definitely attack with all their might if he declared a caliphate. So he just declared an emirate, saying that he's just a prince, an emir, he's just a prince. And he began to consolidate power.
That whole movement was called Movement of the Men of the Black Rahman. And various modern ISISes cherry pick various sort of iconography or sort of imagery, I should say, or objects, symbology, that's what I was trying to say, from various kind of pieces of this. And it's one of the big components is the idea of Arabs ruling non-Arabs, and building kind of an empire from that. And so the creation of this emirate, what was really, and another piece of imagery that's important is that he was called the Falcon, right? That was, and I don't know what that is actually in Arabic, but whatever that word is, and I'm sure you know, Richard, or you'll find it in 3 seconds. But but so all the falcon imagery and sort of iconography and the worship of that power going all the way through Saladin and others, it traces it back to here. And so there's just a couple interesting things about sort of this period and how it sort of even relates to this day.
Yeah.
Richard, is emirate is kind of same as in Europe we call the principality?
It's exactly the same. Emirate is just
Okay.
the Arabic equivalent of principality. But notice his emirate was the size of a country, right? So it's just a term, but the reason he uses this term as opposed to Khalifa or Caliphate is because he doesn't want to signal that he's challenging the authority of the Abbasids, who control all of the Middle East, right? They have a lot more resources at their disposal than Abd al-Rahman does.
So the emirate, the base is kind of like independent, just like a prince in Europe.
Yeah, exactly like
they
that.
just okay, got you.
So one of the, I just sort of wanted to lay this sort of out because this gets very sort of interwoven very quickly. So we've got a lot of ethnic groups and we have a lot of divisions in terms of the population that is existing in Spain at this time. So we've talked about the Arabs and we've talked about the Amazigh. We know the difference between Sanhaja and Masmuda and Zanata. We've sort of addressed that. And the majority of Amazigh that are moving into Spain at this time are Masmuda or Zanata. But also we have to realize that the Amazigh moved into Spain in various waves. It wasn't just that they showed up in 711. There was constant migration between Morocco and Spain. And so Amazigh that came at later periods tended to be a little bit more, quote, wild, if you want to call them that, than the Amazigh that had already lived in Spain because of the opulence and the style of life that existed in Spain. Many Amazigh who got to Spain became more relaxed in their views, less aggressive and more cultured. And so new waves of Amazigh began to differ with the views of their Amazigh brethren who were already in Spain. Another group that starts developing who are called Muwallad in Arabic or Muladi in Spanish. And these people are Iberian-born converts to Islam or their children, right? So in this case, we're talking about, for want of a better term, white people who are Muslim and are presumably the same as other types of Mawali, right? They're non-Arab Muslims, but these are specifically ones who are Spanish. And the term Muwallad, from which Muladi is based, means the one who is born, right? So the Muwallad, those who are born there. You also have the Mozarabic Christians. In Spanish, that's Mozarabes. In Arabic, it's Mustarab. The Mozarabic Christians are Catholics by religion, but they dress and act in the Arab style, right? They may speak Arabic or they may speak Proto-Spanish, but they are wearing the long tunics and other kinds of clothing that would signal to the viewer that they were part of Arab society. They were not dressing like Europeans. The last ethnicity that I want to talk about are Sakaliba, or Saklib is the singular, Sakaliba is the plural. And Sakaliba are European slaves. There was a huge slave trade throughout this period. You can see a picture on the lower left-hand side of slave trade with the Slavs, where the majority of Sakaliba came from. But there were also Sakaliba who came from southern France because there were raids along the coast, and Italy for the same reason. And these slaves, these Sakaliba, were usually placed in military or bureaucratic positions. Sakaliba were very rarely used for manual labor. You had a number of other slaves, usually African slaves, for that more manual role. And that's
Richard.
Yeah.
Richard, you don't mention the Jews.
I was gonna get on that's under the divisions.
Okay.
Yeah. So you've got the first division, of course, is you have slaves and free people. We talked about Sakaliba. There were also African slaves in in Spain because of the trade with the slave trade with Africa. But the two dominant types of slaves were Sakaliba and Africans. You did not really see a lot of Turkic slaves in Spain because of how remote Spain was. The next sort of thing, as Ralph brings up, that I'll sort of skip to, is religion. We talked about Mozarabic Christians. There were, of course, Jews who lived in this territory. The Jews took on the dress of the Arabs rather readily. We don't see a lot of resistance to changing dress among Jews. There was some among Christians.
Excuse me, can we go back a sec to why were Africans chosen to be slaves?
Because the trading networks already were established. I mean, we sort of covered this before, but the Algerians, Moroccans, and Tunisians of this period, right, the Rustamids, the Idrisids, and the Akhlavids, established trade relations with Ouagadougou. And they did that through the Tuareg, who are a Sinhaja
Right.
group, and those empires traded slaves.
It continued.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a huge demand. The Tunis slave markets, the Cairo slave markets were booming during the 9th and 10th centuries. At this point, they're just getting started, right? Because we're talking about the late 700s. But there is absolutely an influx of slaves coming through Morocco or Algeria to Spain. And the Sakaliba were in very high demand because the Sakaliba were seen as very intelligent. You could give them administrative matters where you couldn't give those to the black slaves, right? That was sort of the ideology.
The trading networks, once all the military matters were generally speaking settled, the trading networks just exploded. I mean, just in terms of the scale of them. So I mean, so whether it was trading goods or obviously slaves, I mean, you know, the numbers clearly went up pretty dramatically because you just had a lot less friction in the and risk in relative terms.
But why did they need slaves from outside if they can slave the local population? I mean,
you could enslave local Christians and Jews, but they were paying the jizya, and once they pay the jizya, they're protected, right? Under Islamic law, if the Jews and the Christians, if they pay the jizya and the other requirements, they are allowed to be dhimmi. They're allowed to be subordinate people, right? Protected people. The thing is that, so if they were protected, then you couldn't enslave them and you had to get your slaves from elsewhere, which is why they enslaved pagans, be it your white pagans or black pagans. And when it comes to the captives that were raided off the coast, it was sort of didn't see anything, don't ask. Sort of policy.
And there was a fairly robust trade in Black Sea slaves also, or peoples of the Black Sea who were considered obviously pagans or or sort of non-associated religious actors. And then you also had the same thing as they sailed around various parts of Western Iberia and France. They would cherry pick off any population that they could get and enslave them also. And they basically paid people to run around almost like bounty hunters, basically.
Yeah. And the last thing, now that we've taken care of, the religion, we have the three dominant religions. We don't really see a lot of variety within the religions, right? Judaism in Spain is almost uniformly rabbinical Judaism. We don't really see much dissension or difference there. Christianity in the empire is almost all Catholic, and Islam is almost all Sunni of the Maliki school. We really don't see much diversity within any of the religious groups. Finally, one of the things that we need to take into account during the Emirate period, which is from 756 until 929, is that each of the local governors that have been installed by the Umayyads controlled his territory incredibly strongly. And there are even emirs during that period who can barely control anything outside of Cordoba, which was their functional capital. So you had at least nominal adherence to the law and to the unity of the Umayyad Caliphate in Cordoba. But in practice, that wasn't necessarily how this worked out.
Richard, just a question on that. You say the Umayyad Caliphate.
Sorry, Umayyad Emirate. I misspoke.
Okay, yeah, there was no caliph there, right?
Yeah.
And so the Umayyads, I guess, didn't really recognize any caliph. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. They considered the Abbasids to have the title, but not be legitimate in having it. And of course, as we move into the early 900s, the Fatimid Shiites will declare their caliphate. Of course, they're not going to recognize the Shiite caliphate as being legitimate either. All right. So one of the things that sort of illustrates during the Emirate period how independent these sorts of regions are is that this is a particular situation between Charlemagne's successors in France and the Carolingian Empire and some of the territories within the northeastern part of the Umayyad Emirate. So you have Barcelona, which is ruled by Suleiman al-Arabi, and you have Saragossa, which is ruled by Hussein al-Ansari. And so these are two governors that were appointed by the Umayyads to these regions. Suleiman al-Arabi was actually pro-Abbasid, and so he reached out to the Carolingian Empire, saying that they would provide support for the conquest of the Spanish March, and they were sure that Hussein al-Ansari would support this.
Richard, just another question. On the Umayyads here means Abdul-Rahman and his successors?
Correct. They are still the same family as the ones that were ruling Damascus, right? It's not a different family, but they lost their power in Damascus to the Abbasids, and so the dynasty is continuing only in power in Spain.
Oh, so I got it. So basically, the Emirate is Umayyad family.
No, the Umayyad Emirate is the Umayyad family. There are other emirates that exist.
Oh, okay. But in Spain, that's a Umayyad Emirate.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So
is today's in the anything with today's Emirates, in the
no, for
United
example, yeah, exactly. United Arab Emirates. There are actually 9 emirates that currently exist in the Persian Gulf region, right? You have Kuwait,
Yeah.
you have Qatar, and then you have the 7 that came together as the United Arab Emirates, right? So each of those states, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Fujairah, Ras Al Khaimah, all of these states are individual principalities that have their own princes. And so the United Arab Emirates is simply 7 of them, 7 out of those 9, deciding that they wanted to have one international representative, right? They would rather negotiate as a unity than as individuals. Qatar and Kuwait decided to be independent states.
So are they belong to any of the Umayyad of Abbasid?
No.
They're different.
Yeah. As you noted earlier, emirate just means a principality.
So you mean 2 emirates not belong to the United Emirate is Kuwait and which one?
Qatar.
Oh, Qatar. Okay, got it. Okay.
And they trade on the sort of mythology of this too, right? So the GCC Council, the Gulf Cooperation Council, they have different symbols that go back, to this period that they sort of cherry pick.
Absolutely. Ralph, I think you had a question. Yeah.
Yeah, Rich, is Abdul-Rahman still around at this point, or is it his immediate successor? Is there a single line of succession among the Umayyad emirs?
There is a singular line of succession, which survives until the dynasty just ends. And as is typical of dynastic lines that exist for over 500 years, right? For 300 plus years, you begin to have a lot of duds towards the end. You know, people who can barely wash themselves, people who are inbred. You have all kinds of problems, which we're going to see when we get to later periods in Umayyad Spain. So, but in this period, we have, I don't remember which emir was in power at this point, but it was not er-Rahman. I think he was dead by this point. So it would be his, yeah. So anyway, so but notice that two Umayyad governors, Sulayman al-Arabi and Hussein al-Ansari, at least on paper, are going to support a Christian Carolingian empire against their own sovereign, who's the same religion as they are. And Sulayman al-Arabi actually follows through. So the Carolingian empire comes through to Barcelona, and Sulayman's forces join with the Carolingian forces, and they make their way to Saragossa to talk to Hussein. And when they get there, Hussein claims that he never made any overtures and that he's absolutely not interested in anything to do with an alliance with the Carolingian Empire. So they begin a siege, and the siege is finally lifted when there's a peace accord between Hussein and the Carolingians. But as part of that peace accord, Sulayman al-Arabi, who had gone with Hussein, was taken as a captive back to France because the Franks considered him a traitor, in that he did not actually give what he promised, which was that Hussein would ally with them. His sons then decided to fight alongside with the Basques, because as the Franks were retreating, they ripped Pamplona, which was the Basque capital, to shreds. They thought that the Basques could be an Arab ally, and therefore they wanted to make sure that they would never have to come to the Spanish March again. Well, the Basques knew the region far better than the Franks did, and so the Basques attacked the French at Roncevaux Pass. And the Franks had no idea what was going on. The two sons of Sulayman al-Arabi brought Arab forces on the side of the Basques against the Franks to recover their father, which they did successfully. And the Basques slaughtered the French nobility. Many French heroes were lost in the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, including Roland, the one for whom there's a very famous French song from the medieval period.
Song de Roland.
Yeah, exactly, that Roland. So this should give you an idea, and we're going to see this time and time again, that it mattered far less what religion you were. It mattered what political advantage you could gain by taking one side or another. So we're going to see many cases where a Muslim state or a Christian state will ally with a state of the opposite religion in order to achieve an end against members of their same religion. Right? Sulayman al-Arabi was supporting the Abbasids over the Umayyads, and he thought that the Carolingian conquest of the Spanish March might give him the opportunity to get increased power. All right.
Just a quick. So you said he was supporting the Abbasids. Now, was there an Abbasid power base in Spain?
There wasn't an Abbasid power base in Spain, but the Abbasids did launch several amphibious invasions in the late 700s to try and take Spain back. And
around Gibraltar?
No, around the French border, because the Abbasids had good relations with the Franks. Remember when we talked about Harun al-Rashid, he had those gift givings. The relationship between Carolingians and the Abbasids was actually very good. All right, so towards the end of the Emirate period, many areas of the Emirate were functionally independent or under the rule of somebody that was, while nominally loyal to the emir, was actually running more or less independently. And so you can see there's that hard sort of that hard sort of blue line that cuts Spain between the purple areas and the yellow areas, right? The yellow areas are the areas claimed by the Umayyad Emirate in 929. But you can see all of those small areas that are excised that are controlled by various rebel leaders. Probably the most powerful of these was Omar ibn Hafsun. He controlled the area in the southernmost part of Spain, that sort of brownish area that includes Ronda, Bobastro. Bobastro was his capital. Ronda, Bobastro, Lucena, Isnajar, all of these areas. Now, Omar was a Muladi, right? He was a Spanish-born Muslim, and he controlled this empire primarily because he was told by a fortune teller that he would control the empire, right? So he was fighting for his own territory, and because of these revolts, there needed to be a strong and capable ruler who would be capable of reunifying Umayyad Spain. And so enter the next successor to the dynastic line, Abd-ar-Rahman III. And so Abd-ar-Rahman III was also very charismatic and managed to lead a direct attack on Omar ibn Hafsun's territories. And it took 14 years to quell the uprising. But Abd-ar-Rahman III persevered, and he also put down all of these other smaller revolts that had occurred throughout this period, especially those that still survived, like Ibn Marwan's. Now, once he did that, he realized that he had enough power, and the Abbasids were incredibly weak, right? This is 929. So if we put back on our Middle Eastern caps, right, this is the middle of the Iranian intermezzo. The Abbasid Caliphate barely controls anything outside of Baghdad. They control some of Iraq, but that's about it, right? The Buyids are advancing on them from the west, advancing on them from the east. The Hamdanids control Syria. Basically, the Abbasids have no external outreach power, and they are the only state at this point declaring themselves a caliphate. So Abd-ar-Rahman III, in celebration of the fact that he has unified Umayyad Spain once again, he declares that this is no longer an emirate. He declares that it is a caliphate, right? This is the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, starting in 929 until the caliphate is abolished in 1031, right? So about 100 years, and this is the height of the internal culture in Spain, right? This next century, from 929 to 1031, is the time when Islamic Spain will have the greatest cultural development, philosophical, artistic, and the rest of it. Cordoba really becomes a center of the Islamic world.
The Reino de Asturias. Reino, I guess, implies Christian.
Reino is kingdom, right? But yeah,
Right.
On this map, it's Christian.
So that that light purple area up there belongs to the sort of Frankish. It's part of the Charlemagne's empire.
It's not Charlemagne's. It's when the Umayyads conquered. If we go back to the several maps, you can see here the territory that the Muslims were able to take did not include the northernmost mountainous areas of the Iberian Peninsula, specifically because they were northern and mountainous. Right? You had a lot of dense forests. It just was a bad terrain to conquer. And so the Arabs decided it would make much more sense to avoid those territories and presumably come back later. They just never had a later, because from that point onwards, that mountainous kingdom of Asturias was able to defend itself.
And even back to the Goths, and I mean the Visigoths, that was always a challenge. I mean that region has never cleanly been conquered in probably 2,000-3,000 years, right?
But it was not linked to the Carolingians.
No.
So it was a completely independent Christian kingdom.
Yes. In fact, one of the things that we're going to start seeing is that this area subdivides very easily. One of the common relationship dynamics that we see in Andalusia is that when the Muslims are united, the Christians are divided. When the Christians are united, the Muslims are divided. And so while this happens, the tributary relationships change, right? So once Abd-ar-Rahman III was able to unify the Umayyad Emirate and declare the Umayyad Caliphate, suddenly all these Christian kingdoms like the Reino de Pamplona, the Condados Catalanes are semi-independent. They're connected to the French kingdom, but the Reino de Asturias, which splits into Castilla and Leon as two separate entities, they start paying tribute to the Umayyad Caliphate because the Umayyad Caliphate demands it or they'll be attacked, right? And when the Umayyad Caliphate collapses, as we're going to see, and you end up with a number of Islamic principalities, then those states reverse it. So then the Kingdom of Castile starts demanding from the Arab principalities tribute.
Richard, I have a question. That Asturia at the time that it was the smallest, was it Visigothic, if not Carolingian? Was it the Visigoths still there?
You had a mix. So you had people who had fled from the south further north when the Islamic conquest came. You had Basque people, especially in the eastern parts, right, where you can see the Reino de Pamplona. Most of that is Basque country. A little bit west of that is also Basque country. You also had the indigenous population from there, which was former,
South Iberian, you're talking about?
Some of them were South Iberian. Some of them were North Iberian. Some of them were, when I say South and North Iberian, I mean Roman, ethnically Roman people, if you want to call it that. And some Visigothic nobility. I mean, the Visigoths as a percentage of the total population were very low. They were the ruling class. And also Basque people who predated the Romans. So you had sort of a mix of people there, but it was all Catholics.
But that's from where the Reconquista started, right?
That's where it started, yeah.
Yeah, so like I always thought Reconquista was associated with Visigothic kind of, but yeah, you're saying they were probably mostly ruling, but not the majority of population there, right?
Well, and you have to realize there was also conflict with the Galicians, northern Portuguese. So what would happen is, I mean, it's sort of crazy, right? So the Asturians would fight the Muslims to the death. Tens of thousands would die. You would assume that's going to mean, perpetual war forever. Then they'd have a peace. And then the Asturians would start fighting the Galicians. And so there was, you could almost argue there was a more contractual architecture, and they're fighting with the Muslim piety than there was with their sort of Christian rivals. I don't know if you feel that's true, Richard, but
yeah, no, but
my reading of it.
Yeah,
and a lot of
But who were Galicians ethnically?
Just a note on that: the Galicians were Celtic. This is like they were the people. They're related to the people of Gaul, or even Wales is cognate with Galicians. These were, I believe, British Celts who fled. Well, no, I guess I'm not sure that's true, but they were Celts people who ended up there. Some of them may have fled from Britain with the conquest by the Anglo-Saxons, but there was this small Celtic community in there, like there was in Cornwall and Wales. Thanks.
Yeah, they go back to the Subics. So
don't forget,
no, but they still speak the Celtic language,
Exactly.
Galicians. I recall.
Don't forget,
You're right, Ralph. I agree with that.
Don't forget, the Visigoths
they were
invaded.
Celts, but they've lost most of their language. The dominant language in Galicia is a dialect of Portuguese.
Yeah, nowadays, but I'm talking about there was migrations from Britain because of the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Yeah.
Well, don't forget, when the Visigoths invaded Spain, they were a small ruling minority, very much like the Arabs.
Yeah.
So if the Arabs defeat the Visigoths, they got a whole bunch of Celtic people they can rule.
Yeah.
Well, and they come from the Suevi, right? So, like the Suevi, which were obviously Germanic, as Ralph was saying, they then, their sort of mythology is they cross the Rhine in 406, enter the Roman Empire, blah, blah, blah. And then they, settled all over the place, part of in Austria and part of them in Galicia, et cetera.
Right. We remember that, just to give us some context about Morocco, right, we had this Idrisid dynasty, and the Idrisids were in power pretty much until 927, right? In 927, they're ejected from Fez, and then they sort of have to run for it. And they still survive for another 50 years, but they have no real power, which means that just as the Emirate of Cordoba has become the Caliphate of Cordoba and has grown in power, Morocco, its nearest rival, possibly, was receding in power. So, remember also that the Idrisids were Shia. So, the Caliphate of Cordoba would have preferred to have a Sunni Morocco that they could more easily associate with. And so, into this mix, we need to talk about Almanzor. So, we're going to get back to why I mentioned Morocco in a bit, but I want to sort of explain this character. So Almanzor, his real name is Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Abi al-Amir al-Ma'afiri, but everybody calls him Almanzor, meaning the victorious one. And Almanzor was not an Umayyad himself. He was actually a person of the court, and the Umayyad caliphs at his time were incredibly weak-willed individuals, so he sort of pushed them aside and effectively ruled the country from the year 976 until 1002. So the way that he solidified his power and his right to rule was through his religiosity. So he built numerous mosques and he raided numerous Christian towns. You can see on the map that I provided, the green lands being those that were part of Umayyad Spain when he took power, the dark green ones being the ones he added, and the yellow ones being ones in the Christian kingdoms. He raided over 60 different Christian cities and plundered the wealth from those Christian cities and brought it back to Toledo and then back to Cordoba, which was the capital, right? So we have an incredible number of attacks from Almanzor, and he was able to effectively compel the Christian states to pay him tribute in order to avoid their imminent collapse from his armies. At the same time, they supported the Zenata Berbers, the Zenata Amazigh in Morocco, and he sent military forces as well to Morocco to help deal with the threats there. At the same time, this was the rise of the Fatimids. So you can see on the map on this side, you can see the Fatimids extending their power from what's now Tunisia and eastern Algeria into Morocco. And the Fatimids were supporting a local Zirid dynasty. And so the Zirids were a Sanhaja group. So these Zenata and Sanhaja were fighting in Morocco to see who would manage to control the territory. Eventually, the Umayyads were successful in expelling Algerian influence from Morocco and inaugurating something more of a client-state relationship with Morocco. Any questions on Almanzor or the Caliphate period?
The Basques were Christian, were they?
The Basques were Christian, yes. The Basques are Catholic.
Okay, thanks. Oh, so, just to go back once again, yeah, the kingdom of that kingdom in the north, that of course is much bigger. The kingdom of Asturias is much bigger than the Asturias on that old map you showed. So in some sense, the Reconquista had already.
No, it's the same size.
Go back, yeah, go back further. Further. There, okay, well, if you take that one there, yes, that one there, on the upper right, the Asturias is a very small mountainous area on the coast.
Yeah.
By the time we're at now, that Christian kingdom is much larger than the old Asturias at the sort of time of the Arab conquest. So sure. in that sense, I guess the Reconquista had to some extent started.
It had started, but it hadn't started as a unified Southern progression movement, right? If we
maybe the Arabs were fighting each other so much, that's what happened.
Right. This is the point, is that these were territories that the Christians were able to take because of internecine conflicts, either between Muslim states or between conflicts between Christian states and Muslim states, and the border was fluctuating, that sort of thing. But it wasn't like, when we start getting to the Taifa period, which we're going to see here now, there is going to be this idea of, we will take the South, right? And all the states, all the Christian states are going to be unified in this objective, or at least quasi-unified in this objective. That's not happening yet. But what is happening is that during the same time period, we have the events that make Santiago de Compostela a holy place, right? You can see Santiago on this map on the upper left-hand side. And because of that, you begin to have Frankish immigration to the northern Christian kingdoms, which brings in a wealth of new technologies, new art, science, and makes these kingdoms significantly stronger. So as we move to 1031, we have a full collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate because Hisham III, the last caliph, had no children that were able to take the throne. So there was no ruler, and now these territories that have been ruled by different governors became independent. Right, the map on the left is sort of more color coded for seeing the different states and how big they are. The map on the right hand side sort of tells you who's ruling them. So you have some states that are ruled by Amazigh that had come from Africa in the last 100 years, right? Those are the green states. You have some that are ruled by Amazigh that had been in Spain from the moment of the conquest, or maybe a little bit later. That's the blue. You have states that are controlled directly by Arabs. Those are the ones that are in yellow. You have some that are controlled by the Sakaliba, right? These Slavic slaves, similar to how the Mamluk as slave soldiers became the masters of their own destiny, the same with Sakaliba. So you have states that are run by Sakaliba, and those are orange. And you also have states that are ruled by indigenous Spanish, the Muladi, the indigenous Spanish Muslims, and those are sort of pinkish gray. So you can see that the different small kingdoms, or Taifa, which means sectarian territories, the different Taifas are ruled by people from various different ethnic groups, and which had revolted against the Umayyads in the earlier periods, right? We saw that map with Abdurrahman III.
Richard, I'm sorry. So in the map on the right, the orange is Slavos, that's slaves?
Yeah, no, they're talking about the Sakaliba, right? The Slavic slaves.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, right. And similar to the Mamluks, as I said, these slave soldiers who were originally slaves basically took over power. So now they're not slaves anymore, they're kings. So at this point, right, if you look at the map, we've got 5 different Christian kingdoms, and you can't actually see it on this map, but there's about 50 to 60 Muslim taifas. Some of them are so small that it's not worth putting them on a map like this, right? So now the balance of power has completely shifted, right? We previously had one unified Umayyad Caliphate, and now we have a number of these different emirates and kingdoms.
So, Richard, what's the difference when we call Taifa and emirate?
Taifa is a term that's used almost exclusively with Spain. Taifa comes from the Arabic word taif, meaning sectarian or part, because Spain became divided in such a way, this is an Arab pejorative term towards what happened here, because this was seen as a huge negative, right? This was seen as the collapse of Muslim power in Spain. So they call it the Taifa, the sectarianism that broke apart the country.
Oh, so basically it's the same thing, just one negative, one positive term.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but people don't use Taifa outside of Spanish context. They wouldn't use it for like a breakup of the Middle East or something like that. But they will use the term Taif to refer to sectarianism. So because the Christians become much more powerful, we start to see new relationships forming between these Christian states and the Muslim states. So one of the perfect examples is that you can see on this map that Toledo is a kingdom that's ruled by the Amazigh, and is directly on the border with the county of Castille, which would become a kingdom in the year 1035. So the kingdom of Castille, by this point, ruled by Alfonso VI, established a relationship with Al-Mamun, who was the ruler, the Amazigh ruler of Toledo. Eventually, though, he conquered the city from his son, Yahya al-Qadir. And you can see this is a tile inscription made by modern Spaniards of this conquest. And you can see Alfonso VI receiving the keys of the city from Yahya al-Qadir. The way he managed to get the city was by protecting it from other Arab taifs. And you can see when he took the city, he left most of the old city intact, which is why we have the old city. Alfonso VI also inaugurated what was known as the Convivencia, because this was the first time from the Spanish perspective, meaning the Catholic Spaniards, from the Spanish perspective, that you had the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims living together in the city. Of course, the power structure was now reversed. Now it was the Catholics who were the more powerful ones, and the Muslims and Jews were allowed to keep their religion, but were secondary citizens. There was also conflict between the Mozarabic Christians and the Christians coming from the north because of the style of dress, and the Christians from the north couldn't tell the difference between the Mozarabic Christians and the Muslims in the territories that they had conquered because the dress style was the same. Also, by this time, Mozarabic Christians were speaking Arabic as their dominant language. So it was very hard for Spanish-speaking Christians really to recognize their fellow co-religionists.
So, as we know, Jews and Christians paid, jizya or millah. Was there anything like that?
It was more that there were legal restrictions on what they could or couldn't do and where they could or couldn't live, than rather a tax. But I don't remember the exact setup in terms of taxes. I would imagine that they'd be taxed more, but I don't know if there's a specific tax that is like the non-Christian tax.
Right. I know that Toledo, this is the golden age of Toledo. This point when the Christians conquering, and people don't know a lot about it. That actually was the golden age of conquest of Christians. That
was the golden age on the Christian side. It wasn't the golden age on the Muslim side. The golden age on the Muslim side was between er-Rahman and Almanzor.
Correct.
Right. That period in the 900s, that was the Islamic golden age.
Right.
Jews did have to pay a tax.
Yeah. Okay.
During.
Just a minute. This is Toledo, you say, on the right.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that, as I understand it, from a sort of early Renaissance perspective, the Christian control of Toledo, with its, I think, a large library of Arabic and Greek texts, of Eastern texts, was sort of the beginning of the reintroduction of classical knowledge into Christian Europe.
Absolutely. Mozarabic Christians, Muslims, and Jews who were fluent in Arabic were the ones who were primarily tasked with translating them into Latin, so they could be circulated around Europe. And so you ended up, because we've talked about sort of these translation houses in Baghdad that were translating everything into Arabic. During the Convivencia, you had this massive attempt by the Castilians to have a translation house to translate everything into Latin.
But also afterwards, when Spain becomes more trenchant in Christianity, that's all those intellectuals, and they have to leave the country and they went to Europe. So that's why all the knowledge also spread out in Europe. Yeah,
no, that's right. So we've missed Morocco for a while, but now we come back to Morocco. So you had this Zenata kingdom that was aligned with the Umayyads, and it survived their fall. But the problem is that you had a number of individuals, especially Abdullah ibn Yassin, went to Mecca and then discovered how badly the Sanhaja Berbers were practicing Islam, like that they weren't following the religion very strictly. And because of this, Abdullah ibn Yassin claimed that this is why the Sanhaja Berbers were losing control of Morocco. If they were able to embrace the true meaning of Islam, then they could conquer not only Morocco, but other kingdoms like Ouagadougou, right? We talked about that kingdom, Ouagadougou. And they could even maybe take Spain. So you began to have this Sanhaja Berber army begin to be consolidated throughout the desert. And as you can see, they attacked even to the territory of Ouagadougou, taking the city of Al-Dagos, which was the last major city before Kumbisare. Kumbisare was the capital of Ouagadougou. So they launched an invasion and they were actually able to take Morocco. And then a very curious thing happened. A number of the Taifa states actually reached out to Yusuf ibn Tashufin, who was the ruling leader of this group, and said, would you mind conquering Spain for us? When we're unified, we can fight the Christians. And you seem to have a quite powerful train behind you. Why don't you bring that? So just to put in some context, right, this group of the Sanhaja Amazigh called themselves Almoravids, the men of the fortress, because it was in places like a solitary fortress where they were able to find the true meaning of Islam, according to them, right? And so the term Almoravids became known in English as Almoravid.
And more or less, when is this time? What?
This is around 1080, I want to say.
Okay.
Yeah. So they fight a battle to get into. So they fight a battle to get into southern Spain, and they conquer almost all of the Taifas, but they don't seem to make a lot of progress into the areas of Spain that were under Christian control. So you can see what the map looked like in 1094, right? The Almoravids controlling the southern area, the Christians controlling the north, and Saragossa being a Muslim kingdom that was more aligned with the Christians than with the Almoravids. One of the fundamental things that separated a lot of Spanish Muslims from the Almoravids is that Spanish Muslims were living a nice life. They had functional cities with most of the modern luxuries of the day, and the Almoravids were Sanhaja, right? They were Amazigh who had lived in the desert. They weren't used to these high-level luxuries, and so they had a more restrictive version of Islam and a more restrictive way of behaving. And when the Emir of Saragossa heard about what these Almoravids were like, he was like, you know what? I'd rather stay independent. I'll take my chances with the Christians.
But they thought that the Christians will be better than the other Muslims.
Yes.
Why?
Because the Christians had the same way of life, the same
At the time. Okay.
Right. This is something that we're going to see periodically when we have conflicts on the borders, be it the Crusades, be it the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans, the interplay here in Iberia. People tend to trust their neighbors, even if they're of the opposite religion, than people from a faraway area with a very different sense of how to live life.
Well, because they are your neighbors and you know them.
Right.
Richard, just a distant linkage. So the Christians were now on the march against the Muslims in Spain. Meanwhile, the Seljuk Muslims were on the verge of conquering conquering Istanbul and the Byzantine Empire. So at this point, it was this point that the Byzantine Emperor sent his appeal to Rome and to Christian Europe to help save them from the Muslims. And I think it was partly the sense that the Christians were on the march against the Muslims in Spain that gave them some idea that they might be able to do something similar in the Middle East.
Yeah, I'm trying to see. Okay, I put the slide out of order, that's why. The great battle between the Almoravids and the Spanish Christian Confederation happened at Sagrajas, which you can sort of see is close to the border with Portugal today. Just north of the city of Badajoz in western Spain, and that city, that area is Sagrajas is actually a Spanish corruption of the Arabic as-Salaka, and Salaka means the unsteady ground, or unsteady ground is probably the best translation, because between the marshiness of the area and the fact that so many people died that it was very difficult to stand in that area. That's how it got that name. And while it was an Almoravid victory, it was almost a Pyrrhic victory because of how many Almoravid died to have it, which meant that they couldn't expand or push further into Christian territory. So at this point, we have the legend of El Cid. And El Cid is, of course, very famous in Spanish history, but I'm going to dig a little deeper into who he is. So you can see in the center, this is a statue from Burgos of El Cid. And the term Cid is actually a corruption of the Arabic Sayyid, or master. And he got this title because although he was born in Castile and he served in the court of Alfonso VI, right, that same king of Castile who conquered Toledo, there was a fear that he may try to take over the kingdom, and so he was expelled, he was banished. So he decided to give his services to the ruler of Saragossa, right, that Muslim ruler of Saragossa. And he had his own Christian contingent of 2,000 knights and soldiers that fought for this Muslim leader, and he fought for him for nearly 20 years. That's where he got this term Sayyid, for fighting on behalf of Saragossa as a chief commander. And he won a number of victories for Saragossa, especially against the Almoravids. Eventually, he was brought back to Castile because his skills were deemed more important than whatever worry he may have. And he became a strong ally of one of the king's brothers, whose name was Sancho. When Sancho was assassinated, El Cid was sure that Alfonso VI was behind it. And so you have this picture on the left-hand side, which is Alfonso swearing on the Bible that he had nothing to do with the murder of his brother. And El Cid accepts this and serves in the court of Alfonso, but always with one eye open, if we can say.
If I may add, Richard, here, when El Cid served under Sancho's, there was a civil war because Sancho's was king of Castile and his brother Alfonso was king of Leon. And during that war, they unseated Alfonso and he was exiled. So he lost his kingdom as a result of it. And when Sancho was assassinated and Alfonso came to power, you can imagine that he lost his kingdom mostly because of the skills of El Cid, because he fought against him with Sancho. So that's why he was very mistrusted and eventually exiled from Alfonso's court.
Exactly
Just a little more, slice of it.
No, that's exactly right. Once back in the court of Castile, though, he decided that he was going to make his own charge against the Almoravids and directly attack their camp outside of Valencia. Now, in this map in 1094, Valencia is coded as a Christian kingdom, but it's only Christian because El Cid himself and his elite troops liberated it, we could say. And he created sort of the Taifa of Valencia, if you want to call it that, with a majority Muslim population. But they were able to hold it for the rest of his life, which was, he died in 1099, and his wife continued to hold it for another few years before the Almoravids were able to conquer it back. In the early 1100s, there was a massive revolt in Morocco by Masmuda Berbers. Now, in this case, the Masmuda Amazigh looked at the Almoravids and said, "Oh, look, you guys, you were such good, pious Muslims before, and then you went to Spain, and you became all, lax about everything. You need to be true to the faith." So you had this man named Ibn Tumars, who, similar to Abdullah ibn Yasin, had Naqida, had a creed, and he whipped up the Masmuda Berbers to launch a war against the Almoravids, and they conquered all the former Almoravid territory, including in Spain. Now, there was a period between 1145 and 1147 when the Almoravids were too weak to hold on to Spain and the Almohads hadn't yet entered, which is technically called the Second Taifa period. I just want to point that out because we're going to cover the Third Taifa period later. And the Almohads were responsible for a significant amount of discrimination against both Christians and Jews living in Spain. They were not interested in the convivencia or any of the similar styles of the previously living Muslims in the area, which bred a lot of dissension from both Iberian Muslims as well as from the Christians who had to fight them. In terms of architecture, they were very famous for a set of 3 towers, one in Marrakesh, one in Rabat that I've not pictured here, and one in Seville. And these 3 towers are actually sisters. And so you can see the one in Seville, which has, of course, now a bell on top of it, because when it became part of the cathedral, they changed the top of it. And the one in Morocco, the Kutubiyya. The Almohads were able to conquer much of northern Africa, but they were not able to expand into Egypt, which was controlled at this point by the Ayyubids, the followers of Saladin. Yeah, thank you. The successors of Saladin. All right. So one of the things that I find personally interesting is a little bit of the Jewish history of Spain, because there was a huge Jewish community in Spain during this period. The biggest 2 communities were Barcelona and Girona. And in Girona lived Nachmanides. You can see a picture of him on the right-hand side, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman. He was very famous for trying to reconcile the beliefs of Maimonides with those who opposed him. And he was also very famous for for the debate he held with Pablo Cristiani over the truth of Judaism and the truth of Christianity. Unfortunately, as the debate went on, the Jewish community of Girona and Barcelona were suffering as a result of the fact that Christians didn't like hearing the descriptions of their religion, and that Pablo Cristiani did not have good evidences to marshal against Nachmanides. So Nachmanides actually quit the debate in order to save the Jewish community.
So the Maimonides lived in Spain during the time?
Well, Maimonides was born in Spain. He moved, but right now I was talking about Nachmanides, who's the man on the right-hand side. Maimonides is the man on the left-hand side.
Okay, I heard he used Arabian, right, to write all his writing?
Yeah, Maimonides wrote primarily in Arabic. He also wrote some things in Hebrew. Nachmanides wrote in Hebrew and I think Latin.
Okay.
Because he lived primarily in areas of Christian control.
Mishnah must have been in Hebrew, right?
The Mishnah Torah, yeah. I don't know if the Guide to the Perplexed was in Arabic or in Hebrew, but he did write a number of treatises in Arabic as well. His Arabic was incredibly well educated. So Maimonides was born in the south of Spain. When the Almohads entered, when the Almohads entered, he fled to Egypt, which at that time was controlled by the Fatimids. He served in the Fatimid court and then later in the Ayyubid court. And his secular profession was as a physician, but he also wrote a number of key Jewish texts, like the Guide to the Perplexed. He wrote the 13 sentences, often called Yigdal by Jews, after its first word, which was sort of the equivalent of the Nicene Creed for Jews. Because of his attempt to codify Jewish belief, there was a significant anti-Maimonist camp that formed in his wake. But at the same time, he managed to be a source of a lot of wisdom in the Jewish community concerning his understanding of the Torah. All right. In the center, you can actually see the Qadi. The Qadi was the Jewish quarter in Girona. Two things I want to sort of point your attention to. The street is incredibly narrow, and this is not an accident. Almost all the streets in the Khalid were extremely narrow, and that's because the size of the Jewish quarter was constrained, but the population kept growing. So the only way to continue to house people was to make the street thinner, to allow more space for housing. The other thing, of course, is that the Khalid couldn't be taller than the other areas of the city, so the floors are actually more compacted. You can see how tightly the windows are leveled next to each other, which shows that the floors are actually shorter. We see this with other Jewish ghettos and communities throughout Europe. All right. By the early 1200s, the Christian kingdoms had united together because Pope Innocent III had declared a papal bull that there should be a crusade against the Almohads. Remember, the crusades in the Middle East had pretty much petered out by this point. By this point, we're on the 6th crusade. But in Spain, this managed to bring together the 5 Christian kingdoms, Aragon, Navarre, Castile, Leon, and Portugal, against the Almohads. And at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, the Almohads were soundly defeated. From this battle comes the great story of the breaking of the chains. If you see the coat of arms of Navarre, because the Spanish coat of arms has the 4 coats of arms of the different regions, you have the coat of arms of Navarre, which is the chains. And this is when King Sancho the 7th of Navarre cut the chains of a number of slaves that had been hauled into the battle by the Almohads. And when he broke their chains, he gave them the ability to fight for their freedom. And this was seen by many as a turning point in the battle, because the slaves with chains were designed to prevent Spanish knights from escaping. This is a map that I sort of wanted to show. This is the slow nature of the Reconquest. You can see this sort of goes to Ralph's question, right? In 750, the Arabs conquered everything except that red region of Asturias. But by 800, the territory that the Christians controlled had expanded significantly. And we can see that expansion continue as we move through the various states, even with the Almoravid conquest and the Almohad conquest. Neither of them were able to significantly reconquer previously taken territories.
This is a great map.
So eventually we end up with, by the late 1200s, by 1270, you can see everything but Granada, everything that's not that dark blue, is in Christian hands. And the areas, and Granada would remain Muslim for an additional 200 years. The reason for this is that Granada was able to make functional alliances with Castile. So one of the things that's worth noting is that even after these territories were conquered, the Muslims were not expelled. They became part of Christian society. And you can see on the left-hand side, the royal castle of Seville, and it was built by a Christian king, but it was built in what was called Mudechar style, the style of the Muslims. So even Christian kings were still building in the Muslim style. We also have the unification of Castile and Leon. Castile represented by the castle, Leon represented by the lion, and so you have this coat of arms when Castile and Leon merged of the lion and the castle together. Now you can see on the right-hand side, the crown of Castile kept growing during the mid-1200s until the early 1300s, whereas the other crowns, especially Navarre, really didn't grow as much. And so Castile became the driving force. This Castile-Leon hybrid became the driving force of the reunification of Spain. Okay. So on the eastern side, though, the reunification was much slower and took place primarily between the Union of Aragon, represented by the tree of Coimbra. The tree on the left-hand side of Subrabra, sorry, so I hate this word, Subrorba. It's a mythical tree that represents the historical antecedent of Aragon. And Aragon is that blue area. And you have on the lower right-hand side, the vertical bars of yellow and red, which represents the Catalan counties. And through the marriage of Queen Peronella of Aragon and Count Ramon Berenguer IV of Barcelona, they created the Kingdom of Aragon together, which then proceeded to conquer Valencia as the Reconquista continued further south. Remember that El Cid had made Valencia Christian, or rather under Christian control, but he lost it to the Almoravids in 1103. This was retaken in the early 1200s. All right. Then finally, we have the Kingdom of Granada. This is the last Muslim kingdom. As I said, they made alliances with the Christians. They were also protected by the Sierra Nevada mountain range, which runs along their border. You can see that they also had a penchant for artistry. This is a ceiling from the Alhambra, and this is, of course, the rest of the Alhambra. You can see Alhambra is a corruption of the Arabic al-Hamra, meaning the red one, referring to the color of the palace. The palace is very famous for its iconic patio of lions, which you can see here. The lions are all around a central fountain. And in the lower right-hand side, we have the Al-Baisin, which in Arabic would have been Al-Baydin, meaning the whites, because all these houses are white. And this area was just to the lower side of the mountain from the Red Palace. Now, the Nasrids, who were this dynasty that was controlling the area, were incredibly reclusive. They maintained relations with the Marinids of Morocco, but generally speaking, they tried to avoid direct confrontation with the Christian kingdoms because they could see the writing on the wall that if they antagonized the Christians, they didn't have the forces to repel them. They paid annual tribute, and it was only in the 1470s when Isabella of Spain and Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon decided that they wanted to unify the country, that they needed to unify it on the basis of Christian faith and on the basis of Christian faith and avoid any interplay between any position for Muslim leaders. So they began to directly attack the Nasrid kingdom in 1470, and even then it took till 1492 for the entire territory to fall into Christian hands. The picture on the right shows the surrender of Muhammad VII, also called Boabdil. His Arabic name was Abu Abdullah, but Abu Abdullah somehow became Boabdil in Spanish pronunciation, and he was surrendering there to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, marking the end of Islamic governing presence in Spain. As we know, the Jewish Inquisition occurred in 1492. Muslims were finally expelled from Iberia in 1536.
And can I add something, Richard?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a fun fact, in that battle of Granada, I'm sure you all heard of the Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon. He actually was fighting in that battle alongside the Castilian army. Just gonna add, would you agree that really the battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 is really like the turning point where the Reconquista really starts taking full shape and momentum?
I would say Las Navas de Tolosa was really the end to Islamic control over a significant portion of the country, right? Like they would remain in Granada because of the strategic defenses, but in terms of the majority of southern Spain, that was it. It really broke Almohad control of southern Spain. And I forgot to say that Almohad comes from the Arabic al-Muwahhidin, meaning the unifiers, right? That was their sort of understanding of their belief. So if there are no more questions, as I said, Andalusia Part 2, presented by Sergio Martinez, will occur on the 21st of September. So that's 3 weeks from today. And he's going to do a number of slides on the culture, the food, all kinds of other developments in that way. And he's going to do some cosplay for us, showing us the arms and armament of the period. So it's going to be a lot of fun and a very different style of lecture. And
I like to use the word reenactment, Richard. Reenactment.
Reenactment.
Yes, thank you.
So it's going to be a lot of fun, and enjoy the vacation. The quiz will be extra stringent to make sure that you study, during your time off. And I'll see you soon.
So are we have a meeting next week?
We are not meeting next week, and we're not meeting the week after that. Our next meeting is 21st September.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you,
Richard.
Thank you for the
Great
vacation.
job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you, Richard. Very interesting.
Thank you,
Great
everybody.
job. Great job.
I just want to thank Richard, first of all. Thank everybody for joining. And just want to kind of go through schedule.
Quick question, Zach.
Go ahead.
Quick question, Zach. Can we move this Thursday to next Thursday because of the Labor Day weekend and all that kind of stuff?
Oh, yeah, we can do that.
Okay, yeah, and then I'd like to, then we could talk about getting on a regular schedule, because once everything's back to normal, hopefully, whatever that means.
But Sunday we have First Punic War. If you guys would like to join, me and Ralph Z presenting, and then I'll schedule some stuff, and I'll put the 21st for this, for the meeting, and also on 9/8, which I'll put it on the schedule today. We actually have one of the literal pieces that we're going to do. It's going to be like more light piece. It's called Lysistrata by Aristophanes. It's like a little bit of sexual play from back in the days in Greece. That's why I wanted to switch from Plutarch to a little bit of this for 9/8. So it's I'll present that, and I'll have a invitational PhD in Muslim studies. Mohammed is going to probably do Muslim religion or Muslims in China, which we'll once we get to that. I'm just confirming some dates with him, but probably on 9/15 he's going to do a presentation. So
is that online or real time?
It's going to be online on 9/15. I'll post on the meetup. I just hadn't had a chance to post it, but I do have a schedule that I keep up just in case I haven't posted it. Is on a schedule, and I will right now drop the schedule here so that you can copy the link, or the link is on meetup as well, or you can find it on our website as well.
So the day already fixed, right? 9/15.
The date most likely is fixed. They're trying to get in contact with my buddy right now, but he's I'll let you know probably in a couple of days that whether we'll have a
Wednesday. Okay,
right.
So
we're mostly going to be talking
same
about
time?
We're mostly going to be talking probably about Uyghurs, but there's going to be other ethnic groups that's going to be mentioned as well. But in particular is interested because that's where the border of Afghanistan right now. So
yeah, I'm very interested on that. That's why I want to make sure I don't miss it.